He thought he could humiliate the old man right there in the cage. He laughed and taunted him until Chuck Norris entered the arena. What happened next shocked everyone. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video. The air smelled of rust, piss, and burnt rubber, a scent that clung to the cracked sidewalks and the broken windows that watched over the streets like blind, glassless eyes. It was always cold here, even in summer, with wind threading through the skeletons of abandoned houses, stirring ash and wrappers across the gutters, whispering along the graffiti-scrawled walls where the stories of the dead and the hopeless were written in thick spray paint. The nights in this part of Detroit were alive, but not in any way that gave comfort. They were alive with the sound of distant sirens, of bottles shattering against concrete, of muffled cries behind boarded doors, and the dull thump of fists against flesh in darkened corners. Here, the streetlights flickered and died without warning, and the few that burned cast a jaundiced glow over alleys where stray cats and desperate men shared the same cautious silence. This was the hunting ground of Kane Street Dogs Miller, a young man with iron knuckles and a reputation blacker than the alleys he called home. 24 years old, but in his eyes was the weight of a life that had been spent learning that kindness was a myth, and power was the only currency worth earning. Kane was a beast built by the street's hunger. His mother had overdosed on fentanyl when he was 10, the paramedic stepping carefully around the needles on the carpet while Kane sat in the kitchen, eating stale bread, staring at the blood that had run from her nose to the floor. His father had been a ghost long before that, a name shouted in anger by his mother when she was too high to realize the child was listening. Kane grew up in foster homes and on couches, learning to fight in hallways and parking lots, his fists teaching lessons his words never could. At 14, he killed a boy in a fight over $50 outside a liquor store, a glass bottle and adrenaline making him a murderer before he even knew what that word truly meant. They sent him to juvie, but it was just another classroom and he learned well. He learned that fear was better than friendship, that to smile was to invite betrayal, and that pain was the only teacher that did not lie. When he got out, the streets welcomed him back as if he had never left, and Kane took to them with the ferocity of a predator. He grew into a man with shoulders thick from throwing punches, with tattoos marking the map of his survival, with a jaw that had been broken and set again, with knuckles scarred and ridged like the cracked pavement beneath his boots. Behind the old steel factory, where weeds clawed up through cracks and the air always tasted of iron and dust, Kane had built his kingdom. It was a makeshift cage, welded together from rusted rebar and chain-link fencing, anchored in oil drums filled with cement, and surrounded by the hungry faces of those who came to see violence close enough to taste the blood in the air. They came with cigarettes dangling from lips, with beer bottles clinking in brown paper bags, with hands itching to place bets on the destruction about to unfold. It was here that Kane ruled, a predator among scavengers, and they loved him for the cruelty he brought them, for the way he made them feel alive by watching others bleed. They called it the dog pound. Kane called it home. That night, the air was sharp with cold and the smell of cheap weed drifting in clouds from the gathered crowd. A ring of cars parked with headlights aimed at the cage threw pale beams over the cracked asphalt, illuminating the dented steel and the stains of old blood on the ground. Men and women, draped in oversized jackets and cheap jewelry, crowded close to the fence, their breath misting in the air, eyes glinting with the reflection of violence about to begin. Inside the cage, Kane stood shirtless, his skin a canvas of ink and scars, muscles shifting like coiled steel under his skin. His breath was steady, misting softly as he rolled his shoulders, his eyes scanning the crowd, daring them to look away. Across from him stood his opponent, a local man with the shoulders of a boxer, hands taped and ready, fear hidden beneath the hard set of his jaw. Cain smiled, a cold, thin line that held no humor, only promise. The moment the signal was given, Cain moved, fast and brutal, stepping in with a jab that snapped the man's head back, the sound sharp in the cold air. Blood sprayed from the man's nose, dotting Cain's chest, and the crowd roared, a sound of hunger and delight. The man tried to recover, swinging wide, but Cain ducked under, driving an elbow into the ribs, feeling the crack beneath the impact. Hearing the wheeze of air and pain as the man staggered, Cain did not stop. His fists moved with the rhythm of violence, a dance he had perfected, hammering into the man's face, breaking the bone beneath the skin, turning flesh to pulp under relentless blows. The crowd chanted his name, the sound rising in drunken ecstasy as Cain grabbed the man by the back of the neck, lifted his bloodied face, and slammed his fist into it once, twice, 3 times, until the body went limp, dropping to the ground like a sack of wet sand. The cheering turned to screams as Cain planted his boot on the man's chest, lifted his blood-covered hand to the sky, and roared back at them, his voice a primal cry that echoed against the steel and concrete. Then he spit on the broken man beneath him, stepping over the body, kicking it lightly with a toe, grinning as the crowd surged forward, shoving money at the bookies who recorded the payouts with shaken hands. This was Cain's kingdom, where fear ruled and blood was the currency of respect. Here there was no law, no pity, no mercy, only power, and Cain was the king. Later that night, the celebration spilled into the streets, into the apartments where lights flickered over cracked linoleum floors, where Cain and his crew threw parties that smelled of sweat and alcohol, where the music was loud enough to drown out the protests of neighbors too terrified to complain. There were women with hollow eyes, men with twitching fingers and wide smiles, lines of powder cut on the tables with stolen credit cards, guns tucked into waistbands, laughter that was sharp and broken. Cain moved through it all like a storm, slapping backs, kissing necks, snorting lines, drinking until the world blurred, only to straighten with a snap of anger when someone touched him wrong, looked at him wrong, spoke wrong. He punched a man that night, a dealer who spoke too loudly, splitting his lip and knocking him over a coffee table, glass shattering as people screamed and stumbled away, the man scrambling to his knees to apologize as blood dripped from his mouth. Cain laughed, pulling the man up, hugging him, wiping the blood off his face with the man's own shirt, telling him it was fine, that they were brothers, that it was all good. The man nodded, shaking, forcing a smile, his eyes darting toward the door. Outside, the street was quiet, the hum of street lights and the rumble of distant traffic the only sounds. Cain stood in the cold, looking down the street, his breath fogging in the air, the blood on his knuckles drying to a dark brown crust. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with notifications, videos of the fight already being uploaded to social media, his name spreading, the views climbing, the comments filling with praise and fear. They called him the king, the real champion, the last man standing. He believed them. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt Cain's presence in every shadow. Shopkeepers slipped him bills folded in greasy palms, nodding quickly, eyes lowered, the unspoken tax that kept their windows from being smashed, their cars from being torched in the night. Mothers pulled their children indoors when they heard the rev of his motorcycle, the echo of his laughter in the alleyways, the heavy beat of his boots on the cracked sidewalks. Teenagers worshipped him, practicing punches in the alleys, tagging walls with his name, watching his videos over and over on stolen phones, trying to mimic the way he walked, the way he looked, the way he made everyone afraid. And Cain reveled in it. He laughed at the UFC fights he streamed on his TV, mocking the fighters who danced around the cage, who tapped out under pressure, who fought for points and paychecks instead of respect. He called them cowards, told his crew that the real fights were here, in the dirt and the cold, where blood mixed with mud and fear smelled stronger than sweat. Cain's world was simple, and it was his. And so the legend grew, the name Cain Street Dogs Miller becoming a whispered warning, a shouted chant, a curse and a prayer, a name that mothers used to frighten their children into coming home before dark, a name that men said with respect even as they hated the fear it brought with it. In the dog pound, behind that old steel factory, Cain was God, and his kingdom was built on broken bones and the screams of those who dared to stand against him. And for Cain, it was never enough. There was always more to prove, more to take, more to break. Each night, as the city breathed its tired, cold breath, Cain stood in the shadows, waiting for the next fight, the next victim, the next moment to remind the world that he was here, and that he was never going to leave. In that darkness, with the lights of Detroit glinting like cold stars in the distance, Cain smiled, tasting the blood on his lips, feeling the cold wind against his skin, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The morning after another night of violence and cheers brought a cold, hollow silence to the dog pound, the cage still standing crooked with stains of blood darkening the ground beneath it. Broken bottles and cigarette butts littered the frost-kissed concrete, the faint imprint of boots still marking where people had pressed close to the fence to watch the carnage. Cain walked through the remains with a beer in one hand, the taste flat and bitter on his tongue, the other hand sliding along the cold, rusted steel of the cage that had become more sacred to him than any church. His knuckles were swollen and bruised, the skin cracked from repeated impact, but he felt nothing as he flexed his fingers, testing the stiffness with the same absent-minded focus one might give a morning stretch. Around him, the city was waking up, cars rumbling over potholes, buses coughing black smoke into the chilled air. People huddled in oversized jackets with collars pulled high against the biting wind. Children in worn backpacks walked to school with wary eyes, avoiding the gaze of the men smoking on corners, avoiding the gaze of Cain as he stood there, king of nothing and everything all at once. He finished the beer, tossing the empty can into the dirt where it clattered against other cans, the sound sharp in the brittle air, echoing too loud for what it was worth. Back in his apartment, a cramped space above an abandoned laundromat that still smelled of soap and mildew, Cain sat in a torn leather chair with the television flickering blue light across his face. His crew, a collection of street-thick young men with desperate eyes and quick fists, were scattered around the room, sprawled across the floor or perched on broken furniture, smoking and laughing, the air thick with the haze of cheap weed. They were watching a replay of the previous night's fight, Cain's fists moving like hammers, his face twisted in a grin as he dismantled the man in front of him, the crowd roaring around the cage, the camera shaking with the force of people shoving to get closer, to see the blood, to see the violence that made them feel alive. "Look at him beg," one of the crew laughed, pointing as the video showed the man dropping to his knees, hands raised, blood running from his nose and mouth before Cain struck him down with a savage hook that left him sprawled on the concrete like discarded meat. Cain smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He reached for the phone buzzing on the crate that served as a table, his thumb sliding across the cracked screen, notifications lighting up one after the other, the video already climbing in views, comments flooding in with fire emojis, skull emojis, praise, fear, threats, admiration. He scrolled through them with lazy satisfaction, the glow of attention feeding the restless heat in his chest. King of the streets, the real champ, the last man standing. They said it, and he believed it, each word sinking deeper into him, building a throne out of broken bones and drunken praise. His eyes flicked up to the television again, now showing a UFC fight. Two men circling in a bright, clean cage, gloves on their hands, a referee watching closely, commentators chattering in excited tones as the men feinted and kicked, punched and grappled, sweat shining on their skin under the harsh lights. Kane scoffed, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, watching with a sneer curling at the corner of his mouth. "Look at these clowns," he muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. "Dancing around, playing tag, hugging each other on the ground. They call this fighting?" The others laughed, nodding in agreement, eager to mirror his disdain, eager to earn his approval. Kane stood up, pacing in front of the screen, mimicking the fighters with exaggerated motions, ducking and weaving, throwing weak punches in the air before hugging himself in mock grappling. The crew roared, slapping knees, smoke swirling around them as the laughter peeled through the room. Kane's smile sharpened, turning cruel as he grabbed his phone again, flipping to the camera, pointing it toward himself as he stood shirtless, tattoo shifting over his skin with every breath. "You see this?" he said into the camera, his voice low, controlled, the kind of tone that made people listen. "This is what real fighting looks like." He turned the camera toward the television, showing the UFC fighters still circling, one of them shooting for a takedown, the other sprawling, the action slowing into a tactical grind. "This is bullshit," Kane spat, turning the camera back to himself, eyes glinting with the reflection of the screen. "You want to see a real fight. You want to see what it means to survive, to take what's yours, to own every inch of space around you?" He paused, the silence deliberate, leaning closer until only his eyes and bruised knuckles filled the frame. "I'm calling out anyone. Any so-called fighter, any champion, any man who thinks he's hard enough. Come to the dog pound. Step in the cage with me, and I'll show you what real fighting is." He ended the video, breathing hard, the moment wrapping around him like a dark promise. His crew whooped and shouted, slapping him on the back, already sharing the video to their feeds, tagging fight pages, fight forums, flooding social media with Kane's challenge. It was a laugh at first, a street-level taunt aimed at the polished world of organized fighting, a drunken roar into the chaos of the internet, but it quickly began to grow. Comments rolled in, people asking if it was real, if Kane was serious, if anyone would take him up on it. Then someone mentioned Chuck Norris. The name was a joke at first, a meme in the comments, but it kept appearing, people tagging old clips of Chuck, calling him the real legend, the only man who could shut Kane up, the only one who might walk into the dog pound and walk out again. The laughter in the room faded as the name kept coming up, a nervous energy replacing the easy mockery as the crew shifted, glancing at each other, at Kane, at the television where an old Chuck Norris film was now playing. The man younger, faster, his kicks sharp as lightning, his punches dropping men in choreographed perfection. Kane felt a heat in his chest, a slow-burning challenge that was different from the usual itch for violence. Chuck Norris was old, sure, past his prime, living somewhere in the same city, a ghost of the past, but he was a name that carried weight, A name that made people straighten up. A name that would draw eyes. Kane's lips curled into a grin as he leaned back, letting the thought settle into his bones, a plan already forming, the next step in building his legend. The next video was short, filmed in the cage under the cold, buzzing lights, the steel fence behind him, the ground still stained with old blood. Kane stood shirtless, breathing steady, the bruises and cuts on his body visible trophies of his violence. He held the camera close, the focus on his eyes, his voice calm, cold, clear. "Chuck Norris," he said, letting the name hang in the air, letting it draw in every ear listening, every eye watching. "I hear people think you're a legend, that you're the only man who could put me down, that you're still out here, living in my city, acting like you matter." His smile was slow, vicious. "I don't think you got it anymore, old man. I think you're just a ghost, living on stories and memories. But if you think you still got something, if you think you're still a fighter, come down to the dog pound." He tapped his chest with a bruised knuckle. "Step in the cage with me, and I'll show you what happens to legends when they meet the street." He ended the video, tossing the phone to one of his crew, walking out of the cage into the cold night, the adrenaline simmering under his skin, the hunger sharp in his veins. The video spread faster than any before, picked up by local fight pages, by small news outlets hungry for a headline, by forums and social media warriors eager to see if the challenge would be answered. Comments exploded, some calling Kane a fool, others praising his courage, many tagging Chuck Norris, flooding the feeds with the question, would he answer? In the neighborhood, the tension shifted, a crackle in the air as people whispered about what Kane had done, about whether Chuck Norris would come, about what would happen if he did. Older men shook their heads, muttering that Kane didn't know what he was asking for, that there was a difference between a street fighter and a man who had dedicated his life to the discipline of martial arts. Younger men laughed, betting on Kane, calling Chuck washed up, a relic, nothing but a myth waiting to be broken. Kane felt it, all of it, every whisper, every glance, every mention of his name tied to Chuck's, and it fed him, made him feel larger than the streets, larger than the city, larger than the fear he inspired. He doubled down, throwing more fights, making them bloodier, crueler, breaking bones with casual efficiency, stepping over bodies, staring into cameras with cold, dead eyes as he demanded Chuck come to him, demanded that the legend step into the mud and the blood and prove he was worth the stories. And somewhere, in a small quiet house on the edge of the neighborhood, Chuck Norris sat in the early morning light, the sun just breaking over the rooftops, the world quiet and still. He had seen the video, watched the young man with the scars and the empty eyes call him out, heard the laughter in the background, seen the blood on the floor of that cage. He sipped his coffee, the steam rising in the cold air, his reflection in the window lined with the years, with the miles, with the fights and the lessons that had shaped him into something harder, something steadier than youth could understand. He turned off the phone, setting it down with careful hands, and looked out the window at the quiet street, at the frost on the grass, at the world he had chosen to protect in his way. He knew violence, knew what it did to men, what it took, what it left behind. He had spent a lifetime mastering himself, mastering the violence inside him, learning how to control it, how to direct it, how to teach others the weight of their choices. And in that quiet morning, as the world slowly woke around him, Chuck made a decision. Not for pride, not for anger, not even for the challenge itself, but because he knew that sometimes the only way to teach a man what power truly was to meet him where he was, to step into the mud, to show him that real strength was not in how hard you could hit, but in how well you could control the storm inside. Chuck Norris would answer the challenge, and the dog pound would never be the same. The cold of the Detroit night settled like a second skin over the cracked pavement and rust and steel of the lot behind the abandoned factory where the dog pound had been erected, the cage looming in the glare of headlights from the circle of cars parked around it. Their engines hummed softly, throwing plumes of white breath into the darkness as men leaned against hoods, smoking cheap cigarettes and clutching bottles in gloved hands, the glass clinking softly as they shifted in anticipation. The air smelled of burnt oil, weed, and the faint tang of blood that clung to the concrete like a curse, refusing to be washed away by the thin drizzle that had begun to fall from the black sky. Inside the ring of metal and headlights, the cage stood waiting, its steel bars darkened from the countless blows and splashes of blood that had stained it over months of unrelenting violence. The ground was damp, the puddles reflecting fractured images of the men who approached it, hungry-eyed and restless, ready to see blood, to see pain, to see the violence that made them forget the weight of their own failures for just a few hours in the cold dark. Kane, Street Dogs Miller, stood near the cage with his crew around him, their laughter sharp and high-pitched as they joked and jostled each other, the excitement in their voices edged with something darker, a hunger that matched the restless energy in Kane's chest. He was bare-chested despite the cold, his skin marked by bruises, tattoos shifting over the hard lines of muscle with every movement, each step quiet and deliberate on the wet concrete. His breath steamed in the air, but he didn't feel the cold. It was nothing compared to the fire that burned in him, the anticipation that crackled across his skin as the moment he had been waiting for finally arrived. Word had spread, faster and wider than even Kane could have imagined. The video had traveled through social media, through whispers on the street, through the desperate voices of men who wanted to see something real, something that felt like the old world before rules and fear diluted the blood in a man's veins. They came in groups, pulled by the promise of witnessing something legendary, a street fight that would become a story told in bars and alleys, a fight between the king of the streets and the ghost of a legend who had once commanded respect just by walking into a room. Chuck Norris had accepted the challenge. They didn't know exactly when he would come. They didn't even know if he would come, but the promise of it was enough to draw them, to have them leaning forward, phones ready, waiting for the moment when the world would pause and let them witness the clash between the past and the present. Kane's crew moved around him, slapping hands with friends, collecting cash for bets, checking the perimeter with the paranoia that always came with gatherings like this, where a fight could be interrupted by sirens, by rivals, by the random chaos that lived in Detroit's veins. But tonight felt different, as if even the city was holding its breath, waiting, watching. Kane stepped toward the cage, the mud squelching under his boots, and climbed through the open gate, turning slowly to face the crowd, lifting his arms to the chorus of cheers and jeers that rose around him. His smile was sharp, white teeth flashing as he looked at the sea of faces, some eager, some afraid, all of them drawn to him like moths to the flame of his violence. He paced the cage slowly, rolling his shoulders, cracking his neck, every movement deliberate, letting the tension build, letting the fear and anticipation grow thick in the air. Someone turned up the music from a car stereo, bass-heavy rap thumping through the cold night, vibrating through the bones of the watchers, making them sway unconsciously, their eyes fixed on the cage, on Cain, on the empty gate that led into the ring. The rain fell harder now, a cold drizzle soaking into their jackets, dripping from the steel bars of the cage, running in thin rivers over the stains of old blood, mixing with the mud that clung to boots and tires. The laughter and chatter began to quiet, a ripple moving through the crowd as the sound of footsteps approached, measured and calm, boots on wet concrete, the sound somehow louder than the music, louder than the whispers, a sound that cut through the cold night and made men turn their heads, craning to see. Chuck Norris walked into the circle of headlights, his presence somehow larger than his lean frame, his movements smooth and deliberate, his eyes steady beneath the shadow of the hood of his simple jacket. He wore no entourage, no camera crew, no crowd of admirers. Just a man walking alone into the place where a challenge had been made, where a promise of violence and blood had been offered, and where he had come to answer. The crowd fell into an uneasy silence as Chuck approached the cage, their phones raised, recording every step, the image of the old man with the calm eyes and the steady breath, walking toward the ring where Cain stood waiting, bouncing on the balls of his feet, the grin on his face freezing for just a moment as their eyes met. Chuck stopped in front of the cage, reaching up to pull back the hood, his silver hair catching the glow of the headlights, the lines on his face sharp but not weak, every crease a story, every wrinkle earned through years of living, of fighting, of surviving. He looked at Cain, his eyes clear and cold, and for a moment the world seemed to stop, the air holding its breath as the two men regarded each other, the past and the present colliding in the cold night. Without a word, Chuck stepped through the gate, closing it behind him with a soft clang that echoed in the silence. The music was turned off, the only sounds now the hiss of rain, the soft purr of engines, the breath of the men and women who stood watching, waiting. Cain tilted his head, rolling his neck, the smile returning as he stepped forward, raising his fists in a loose guard, his shoulders rolling with the easy confidence of a man who had never met an opponent he could not break, who had never seen a man stand up to him for long. He could feel the eyes on him, the expectation, the pressure, and it fed the heat in his chest, made his heart beat faster, made his blood sing. Chuck did not raise his fists. He simply stood, his feet planted firmly on the wet concrete, his eyes locked on Cain, breathing slow, steady, a calm in the storm that made something in Cain twitch, a small, unrecognizable flicker deep in his gut that he quickly drowned with the roar that tore from his throat as he lunged forward, his fist swinging in a brutal hook aimed at Chuck's jaw. Chuck stepped back, the movement so small, so efficient, that Cain's fist cut through empty air, his momentum carrying him forward, his feet slipping slightly on the wet ground. Before he could recover, Chuck's hand moved, a quick, sharp strike that tapped Cain on the chest, not hard, but precise, knocking the breath from his lungs for just a moment, sending a jolt of pain through the bruise that still lingered from a previous fight. The crowd gasped, a ripple of surprise, of disbelief, as Cain staggered back, his eyes wide for just a moment before narrowing, his teeth bared in a snarl as he wiped rain and sweat from his face, lunging forward again with a growl, swinging a series of punches, fast, brutal, aimed to break, to shatter, to crush. Chuck moved like smoke, stepping aside, letting the punches pass, letting Cain's own momentum drain him, each swing meeting empty air or glancing off Chuck's arms, deflected with minimal effort. The rain fell harder, drumming on the steel cage, washing over the two men as they moved, as Cain's anger grew, as Chuck's calm remained unbroken. Cain's breath came harder now, each exhale a puff of steam in the cold air, his fists aching from the missed punches, his muscles burning as he swung again and again. Each strike met with empty space or a soft block that felt like hitting stone, unyielding and solid. The frustration built in him, the anger rising like bile in his throat, the heat in his chest turning into a fire that blinded him, that made him roar as he threw a final, desperate punch aimed at Chuck's head. Chuck stepped in, his hand moving in a blur, catching Kane's wrist, twisting it, pulling him forward off balance, his other hand tapping the side of Kane's head with a controlled strike that sent him sprawling to the wet ground. The mud splashing around him, the crowd gasping, shouting. The sound a wave that washed over Kane as he lay there, stunned. The rain falling on his face, mixing with the sweat, the blood that now trickled from a split lip. He pushed himself up, spitting blood into the mud, his eyes burning as he looked up at Chuck, who stood there, calm, steady, waiting. No mockery, no anger, just patience. The kind of patience that made Kane's rage falter for just a moment, replaced by confusion, by something that felt like fear, like respect. But he shoved it down, forcing himself to his feet, forcing himself to snarl, to growl, to bare his teeth. The crowd was silent now, their eyes wide, their breaths held as they watched the man they had come to see destroy. The king of the streets, the breaker of bones, forced to struggle to his feet, facing the old man who moved with the ease of water, who struck with the precision of a blade, who stood there without fear, without anger, without the need to prove anything. Cain roared again, lunging forward, his fists swinging, his body moving with the desperation of a man who could not afford to lose, who could not afford to be weak, who could not afford to let the legend stand. But Chuck met him, his movements calm, efficient, precise, blocking, deflecting, striking only when necessary, each blow a lesson, each movement a demonstration, each breath a reminder that real strength did not need to shout, did not need to bleed, did not need to break. The fight continued, a dance of violence and control, of rage and calm, of chaos and discipline, the rain falling harder, the mud splashing with each step, each stumble, each fall. Kane's body ached, his muscles screamed, his breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurred with sweat and rain and blood, but he kept coming, kept swinging, kept fighting, because it was all he knew, because it was all he had, because if he stopped, if he failed, if he lost, he would be nothing. And Chuck waited, blocking, moving, striking, teaching. The crowd watched, silent, reverent, afraid, as the king of the streets learned what it meant to face a man who had mastered himself, who had mastered the violence inside him, who had come not to destroy, but to teach, to remind, to show that real power was in control, in precision, in the calm that could stand against any storm. As Cain fell to his knees in the mud, gasping, his fists dropping to the ground, the rain washing the blood from his face, Chuck stood before him breathing steady, eyes calm, waiting, watching. The lesson delivered not with words, but with the quiet, unyielding strength of a man who knew what it meant to fight and what it meant to win. And in that moment, as the crowd held its breath, as the rain fell, as the engines hummed softly in the cold dark, Cain Street Dogs Miller understood, for the first time, what it meant to be truly strong. The rain had stopped by the time Cain forced himself up from the mud, but the cold remained, seeping into his bones as he stood on trembling legs, blood and rain dripping from his chin, mixing with the water that pooled around his boots. His breaths came in ragged, desperate pulls, steam rising from his mouth in uneven clouds as the last drops of rain clung to the rusted bars of the cage. running down like tears over the dark stains that had become a part of the steel. The lights from the cars still burned into the darkness, their beams cutting through the thin mist rising from the ground, illuminating Kane's battered face as he lifted his eyes toward Chuck, who stood a few feet away, silent, steady, unshaken. The crowd around the cage was silent, their faces pale in the glow of headlights, their eyes fixed on Kane as he swayed slightly, wiping blood from his lips with the back of his hand. His crew stood at the edge of the fence, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, fear, and something else, something like shame. As they watched the man they had called king brought low, not by brute force, not by overwhelming violence, but by a calm, precise, unyielding discipline that none of them could understand, that none of them had ever seen before. Kane's chest burned with each breath, his ribs aching with every small movement, the taste of blood thick on his tongue as he shifted his weight, trying to find his balance, trying to find the rage that had always carried him through, that had always burned bright enough to drown out the pain, the fear, the doubt. But it was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness that made his hands shake, that made his legs feel weak, that made the fear crawl up his spine and settle behind his eyes as he looked at Chuck, who had not moved, who had not even raised his fists, who had taken everything Kane had thrown at him and had not broken, had not fallen, had not even flinched. The silence was heavy, pressing down on the crowd, pressing down on Kane's shoulders, making the cold feel colder, the darkness feel darker, as the moments stretched between them, as the sound of the city far beyond the lot returned, the distant wail of a siren, the low rumble of a train, the bark of a dog somewhere down the block, all reminders that the world was still moving, even as Kane's world had stopped in the mud under the glare of those lights. Kane opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Just a ragged breath that turned into a cough, the pain in his ribs flaring bright for a moment, making his vision swim, making his knees buckle slightly before he caught himself, his hand reaching out to steady against the fence, the cold steel biting into his palm, grounding him, reminding him that he was still there, that he was still standing, even if it felt like everything inside him had already fallen. Chuck watched him, his eyes steady, clear, patient, and in that gaze, Kane saw no hatred, no anger, no satisfaction in his pain, only the quiet weight of a man who had seen violence, who had survived it, who had learned from it, who had come here not to break him, but to teach him, to show him something that Kane had never understood, something that he had never allowed himself to see. Kane's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful sound that echoed in the silence as he pushed himself off the fence, turning back toward Chuck, his fists raising again. But there was no strength in them, no fire, no fury, only the automatic response of a man who did not know how to do anything else, who did not know how to stop fighting, even when the fight was already lost. He stepped forward, swinging with a weak, slow punch that Chuck deflected easily, his hand moving in a blur, redirecting Kane's arm, using his own momentum to spin him slightly, sending him stumbling forward a few steps before catching himself, turning back, his eyes wild, confused, desperate. Again, Kane charged, his fists swinging, sloppy and uncoordinated, his breath ragged, his vision narrowing as he focused on Chuck, on the calm, unreadable expression on his face, on the way he moved, the way he shifted his weight, the way he watched, the way he waited. Each strike from Kane was met with a block, a deflection, a redirection. Chuck's hands moving like water, like wind, untouchable, unstoppable, guiding Kane's anger into the empty air, letting him exhaust himself with every missed punch, every failed attempt to land a blow. Minutes passed like hours as Kane's arms grew heavy, his shoulders burning, his fists dropping lower with each swing, each breath harder to catch, the pain in his ribs spreading with every movement, every gasp. His vision blurred, the edges darkening as the world closed in around him, the only sound his own labored breathing, the thudding of his heart in his ears, the quiet footsteps of Chuck moving around him, always there, always steady, always just out of reach. Finally, Kane's legs gave out, his knees hitting the cold, wet ground with a dull thud that echoed through the cage. His hands dropping to the mud, his head hanging low as he gasped for breath, the steam rising from his back as the last of his strength drained from him, leaving him empty, broken, defeated. Chuck stepped forward, his boots silent on the wet ground, stopping just in front of Kane, looking down at him with those calm, clear eyes, the silence stretching between them as the crowd held its breath, waiting, watching, recording every moment on their phones, capturing the image of the king of the streets on his knees before the man who had come to teach him what true strength looked like. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world frozen around them, the weight of the moment sinking into Kane's bones, into his soul, crushing him with the realization of what had happened, of what he had become, of what he had always been. And then, slowly, painfully, Kane lifted his head, his eyes meeting Chuck's, and in that gaze something shifted, something cracked, something that had been held tight inside him for so long that it had become a part of him, something that had driven him, had fed him, had made him who he was. It cracked, and in that crack Kane saw himself, saw the man he had been, saw the fear, the anger, the hate, the need to hurt, to break, to destroy, and he saw it all for what it was: weakness. Chuck reached down, offering his hand, his eyes never leaving Kane's, and for a moment, Kane hesitated, the fear and pride warring inside him, telling him to refuse, to stand on his own, to keep fighting, to keep holding on to the only thing he had ever known. But as he looked into Chuck's eyes, as he felt the weight of the silence around him, as he felt the eyes of the crowd on his back, he realized that there was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to prove, nothing left to protect. His hand lifted, shaking, covered in blood and mud, and he placed it in Chuck's, the grip strong, warm, real, as Chuck pulled him to his feet, steadying him as he swayed, as he caught his breath, as he stood there, broken but alive, defeated but not destroyed. The crowd was silent as they watched, the only sounds of the distant city, the drip of water from the cage, the quiet, steady breathing of the two men standing in the mud, in the blood, in the place where the king of the streets had fallen, where the lesson had been taught, where the past and the present had met, and where something new had been born. Chuck looked at Kane, nodding once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, and in that nod, Kane felt something inside him shift again, something settle, something heal, just a little, just enough. Without a word, Chuck turned and walked toward the gate of the cage, the crowd parting before him, their eyes wide, their faces pale, as they stepped back to let him pass, the silence following him as he disappeared into the darkness beyond the circle of lights, leaving behind the lesson, leaving behind the change, leaving behind the man who had once been the king of the streets, now standing alone in the mud, the rain starting to fall again, washing the blood from his skin, from the ground, from the steel bars of the cage. Kane stood there for a long time after Chuck was gone, the rain soaking through his clothes, dripping from his hair, mixing with the tears that he did not wipe away, that he did not hide, that he let fall freely as he stood in the place where everything he had been had died, and where something new, something uncertain, something fragile had begun to grow. Around him, the crowd slowly began to leave, their whispers carried away by the wind, their footsteps fading into the darkness, leaving Cain alone with the sound of the rain, with the weight of the lesson, with the quiet, painful knowledge that the fight was over. But the real battle was just beginning. A battle not with the world, but with himself, with the darkness inside him, with the anger and fear that had driven him for so long, with the need to prove himself through violence and blood. And in that silence, in that cold, wet darkness, Cain took his first breath as a man who understood what strength truly meant, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never felt before. Hope. The rain fell softly in the gray morning, pattering on the cracked windows of the apartment above the abandoned laundromat where Cain lay on a worn-out mattress, his body aching with every breath he took. The dull pain in his ribs pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, a constant reminder of the night when everything he thought he was had been stripped away in front of the eyes that once cheered his name. He lay still, eyes fixed on the ceiling where water stains shaped dark, ugly patterns above him, the faint scent of mold mixing with the cold air that slipped through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. The world felt quiet, empty, the silence a heavy weight pressing on his chest, leaving him alone with the memory of the cage, the mud, the blood, and the man who had defeated him without hatred, without anger, without even needing to fight back. The room was dark, lit only by the pale morning light that crept in through the cracks, revealing the bottles scattered across the floor, the ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts, the thin layer of dust on the small television that flickered softly in the corner, playing reruns of fights that no longer meant anything to him. His crew was gone. They had left quietly in the early hours of the morning when the rain had finally washed the mud from the streets, slipping away without a word, without looking him in the eye, without leaving behind the noise and laughter that once filled the small space. He did not blame them. He had nothing left to give them. Cain turned his head slowly, pain sparking along his neck and shoulders, his eyes falling on the cracked mirror leaning against the wall. In the reflection, he saw a man he barely recognized, his face swollen and bruised, the cut on his lip scabbed over, the bruise on his cheek darkening to purple and black. His eyes, once bright with the fire of anger and the thrill of violence, now looked back at him with a dull, empty light, the weight of what he had seen, of what he had learned, settling deep in their depths. He tried to look away, but the reflection held him, forcing him to see, forcing him to face the truth he had fought so hard to ignore. Slowly, he pushed himself up, a groan escaping his lips as the pain in his ribs flared, his vision going white for a moment before clearing again. He swung his legs over the side of the mattress, his feet pressing into the cold, dirty floor, his hands resting on his knees as he took deep, careful breaths, grounding himself, steadying himself. The room felt too small, the air too heavy, the silence too loud. He needed to move, to get out, to breathe something that did not taste like dust and regret. He stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, the soreness in his muscles reminding him of every moment of the fight, every missed punch, every effortless block, every precise, controlled strike that had brought him to his knees in the mud. He moved slowly, pulling on a sweatshirt, the fabric scraping against the cuts on his arms, reminding him of the night that had changed everything. He stepped into the hallway, the creak of the old floorboards echoing in the silence, the cold air rushing past him as he opened the door to the outside, stepping into the gray morning. The streets were empty, the puddles reflecting the overcast sky, the steam rising from the sewers, the smell of wet concrete filling the air. He walked slowly, each step a reminder of the pain, each breath a reminder of the lesson, his eyes scanning the familiar streets that now felt foreign, changed, stripped of the power they once held over him. The graffiti on the walls, once symbols of his dominance, now looked like childish scribbles. The tags of boys trying to prove they mattered, trying to carve out a space in a world that ignored them. He saw the faces of people watching him from their windows, the cautious glances of those who had once looked away in fear, now watching him with curiosity, with confusion, with the cautious hope that the storm had passed. Kane stopped in front of the dog pound, the cage still standing behind the factory, its bars wet with rain, the ground around it muddy, the footprints of the crowd washed away, leaving only the faint stains of blood and the memory of the night when the king of the streets fell. He stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, the drizzle soaking into his clothes, his eyes fixed on the place where he had learned what strength truly meant, what power truly was, what it meant to face a man who had mastered himself, who had no need to prove himself, who had fought not to destroy, but to teach. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the mud, the soft squelch of the earth beneath him loud in the silence. He reached out, his hand resting on the cold, wet steel of the cage, his fingers tracing the rust, the rough edges, the scars left by countless fights, countless nights of violence and anger and fear. He closed his eyes, the memory of the fight playing behind his eyelids, the way Chuck had moved, the way he had looked at him, the way he had stood there, calm and steady, showing him with every movement, with every breath, that the true strength was not in the fists, but in the control, in the discipline, in the peace that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. A shudder ran through Kane's body, his breath catching in his throat as the tears came, hot and silent, cutting tracks through the dirt on his face, dripping into the mud at his feet. He did not wipe them away. He let them fall, let them cleanse him, let them wash away the anger, the hate, the fear that had driven him for so long, leaving behind something raw, something painful, something real. He sank to his knees in the mud, his hands resting on the ground, his head bowed, the rain falling around him, the silence pressing in, the weight of the lesson settling into his bones, into his soul. He stayed there, letting the cold soak into him, letting the pain remind him of what he had been, of what he had lost, of what he had found. When he finally stood, the rain had stopped, the clouds breaking above to let a weak sunlight filter through, casting light on the wet ground, making the mud glisten, making the rust on the cage shine with a dull, orange glow. Kyan looked around, the streets quiet, the world waiting, the city holding its breath as if it, too, was ready for something to change. He turned and walked away, leaving the dog pound behind him, each step slow, deliberate, careful, feeling the weight of his own body, the strength in his legs, the pain in his ribs, the steady beat of his heart, each a reminder that he was alive, that he was still here, that he had a choice. The streets felt different now. The faces he passed watched him, but he did not meet their eyes with the glare of a predator, did not carry himself with the swagger of a man who ruled through fear. He simply walked, breathing in the cold air, feeling it fill his lungs, clear his mind, reminding him of the night when everything changed. When he reached his building, he climbed the stairs slowly, each step measured, each breath steady, the sounds of the city below fading as he opened the door to his apartment, stepping back into the space that had once felt like a kingdom, now just a room, empty and quiet. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his eyes falling on the cracked mirror again, seeing the man looking back at him, the bruises still there, the cuts still healing, but the eyes different, clearer, steadier. He reached for his phone, the screen lighting up with missed calls, messages, notifications, the noise of a world that wanted to pull him back into the chaos, into the violence, into the persona he had created. He turned it off, setting it down carefully, letting the silence return, letting the peace settle around him. Outside, the city moved on, the traffic picking up, the voices of people rising, the day beginning as it always did, indifferent to the changes in the life of one man, indifferent to the lessons learned in the mud under the cold rain. But for Cain, the world was different now. The fight was over, but the real battle had just begun, the battle to master himself, to find strength not in the fear of others, but in the peace within himself. He lay back on the mattress, closing his eyes, letting the quiet fill him, letting the memory of the fight, of the man who had taught him what it meant to be strong, guide him as he took a deep breath, the pain in his ribs sharp but welcome, a reminder of what he had survived, of what he had learned, of what he was becoming. And for the first time in his life, as the light from the broken window fell across his face, warming the bruises, drying the tears, Cain felt something he had never allowed himself to feel. Hope. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos on this channel for more stories that stay with you long after they end. And if this video meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to see it too.